Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive into those heart-stopping moments where everything just feels wrong. Today, we're exploring some of the biggest and creepiest scenarios that made people say we need to leave. Now. So sit tight, relax and let's dive in. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. I was 15 years old at that time, and I took approximately 10 of my younger cousins with me to the park. 3 of my older cousins, who were around my age or slightly younger, came along to assist me. As we approached the park, there was a man and 2 other children present. He approached me and initiated a conversation. Despite my attempts to signal that I didn't want to engage, he persisted. I even inquired, "Did you bring your kids with you?" He nodded and continued talking. Subsequently, he posed some strange questions like, "Are you married? Are those your kids? And how old are you?" In response, I provided false information about my name and age, attempting to distance myself. However, he suggested, "I like you, want to sit with me and talk?" I excused myself, claiming that I needed to discuss something important with my family first, promising to join him later. With a smile, I approached one of my older cousins and conveyed, "Act as if everything is fine, but we need to leave immediately." She nodded, and I observed as the 2 children left the park without the man. We began walking home, and I ensured that he didn't follow us or monitor our whereabouts. Later, I discovered that he had momentarily picked up one of my younger cousins, and one of my cousins witnessed it but didn't inform me at the time. Fortunately, one of us saw him enter a house, prompting us to call the police. I'm 19F, and last May, I was on a Greek island with my cousin, 22F, as part of a trip. We enjoyed taking aimless walks outside the towns where we were staying to explore the surroundings. During one of these walks, we found ourselves on a long, narrow road flanked by beaches on both sides. A small green car passed us in the same direction we were walking and stopped about 50 to 100 yards ahead of us, right in the middle of the road. We thought they might be stopping to enjoy the view, so we continued walking. However, as we approached the car, we noticed the passenger side window was down, and a man was staring at us through the mirror. As we walked past, the car suddenly pulled forward again. Right after the green car passed us again, a large black truck drove by in the same direction and pulled up alongside the green car. They both stopped, and it was clear they were talking to each other. The green car then sped off, while the black truck moved forward a bit and stopped again on our side of the road. Our situation was tricky since the road was narrow, and we couldn't turn back because the town was in the opposite direction, and there were only beaches and a few houses behind us. As we got closer to the black truck, the driver opened both the front and back doors to the cab but didn't do anything else. He just stood there outside the truck, mostly looking back at us. We both felt that this was extremely suspicious. Both cars seemed to be keeping an eye on us and communicating in some way. So, we decided it was best to get off the road and onto the beach. We moved as far away from the road as possible and started walking quickly. The man from the truck even crossed the road and watched us with binoculars from the side of the beach. We kept running until we caught up with another couple and followed them back into town. During this time, I saw the same green car drive past us multiple times as we ran along the beach. Thankfully, we made it back to our hotel/apartment safely. Once there, we locked and secured our doors to the balcony and hallway. In summary, our experience on a Greek island during our gap year trip had some concerning moments that made us feel like we were in a situation similar to the movie Taken. I was 15 and had just moved to a new town right in the middle of the school year. I met some kids that seemed cool and took them up on an offer to hang out and spend the night at one of their houses. The evening started off great. The host's mom made pizza for everyone, and they had a pool table and a PlayStation. I was having a lot of fun when they all decided to head up to Mike's and try to buy some weed. I had not been around drugs at all but was feeling rebellious and nervously went along. It turned out that Mike lived in a questionably habitable house trailer about 15 miles out of town in the woods, with somewhat of an entourage of seedy figures. He was a formidable character, lanky, wild-eyed, and rail-thin, with a nervous way about him that instantly put me on edge. I am a big guy, and he instantly started sizing me up, grabbing my shoulders several times, and squeezing my arms. He said I looked like a fighter and asked me if I wanted to fight him. I declined, but he kept telling everyone I was going to fight him. I'm sure I was visibly nervous, but my new friends just laughed it off and asked if they could buy some weed. He insisted that we have a drink first. I had also never drank, but I did my best to choke down the warm beer that was shoved unceremoniously into my hand. I took in my surroundings as we drank. There were tin foil and glass pipes on every flat surface, at least 3 guns, and the rest of the adults looked like they were well ahead of us in the consumption department. My friend insisted on getting the weed, but Mike kept telling him not to be in a hurry. He brought out a bong, lit it, and started passing it around. This was the first time I smoked weed. He harangued me over how I wasn't inhaling enough and then laughed like a hyena when I had a coughing fit. He kept making comments on how I was big and acted tough, but I was really just a big wuss, and other choice words that don't need repeating. He also made comments akin to taking me into the back room and making a man out of me. One of the tooth-impaired women began some long monologue about a man's G-spot being located rectally. I wanted to leave immediately. I took the first opportunity to tell my friend that I thought it best that we leave now. He finally convinced Mike to retrieve the weed for purchase, and an exchange was made. I tried to walk out, but Mike slammed the door when I opened it. He started insisting that I was a narc and that I needed to strip naked so he could check me for a wire. This went on for a few minutes as I just stood there uncomfortably, hoping he would end his little joke and let us go. Finally, he said he'd know I wasn't a narc because I was going to smoke meth to prove it. I looked at my friend and just shook my head, but he was either too stoned, too apathetic, or just thought Mike was being funny. Either way, there was no help there. Mike disappeared to a back room while three men who had been sitting on a couch got up and pushed the couch in front of the door, laughing and telling us to sit down and get comfortable. I had a hallway behind me, and I walked down it, looking for a way out. There was a small laundry room at the end and, to my relief, a door. It was only to my relief until I saw that not only did it not have a handle, it was nailed shut. Mike began yelling for me to come back to the living room. My brain was in a tailspin. Fight or flight. Fight or flight. Do something. Move. I kicked the door. It opened. There were no stairs, so I jumped down to the snowy ground and began to run. I ran into the woods, grateful that I had not removed my coat in the warm house. I heard a commotion behind me as Mike screamed obscenities at me. I kept moving. Then I heard several gunshots. My heart was beating out of my chest. I had a general idea of where the road was and headed in that direction, avoiding the meandering lane that led to Mike's trailer. I slipped on the hillside several times, but luckily there was enough moonlight to navigate through the trees. I heard a loud truck start up and then more yelling. I was leaving a trail but couldn't avoid it. Eventually I reached the frozen dirt road and started walking back towards the highway, staying in the trees. I saw headlights coming and hid, hoping it was my friend. It wasn't. Neither was the next one. I continued walking. It is worth noting that this was years before I had a cell phone. After about 4 miles, the road met the highway back to town. It was harder to avoid walking on the road at this point. It was clear for quite a ways on either side, but when a car came driving by, I ducked down in the snow on the shoulder, trying to get my head just high enough to see, hoping it was a police cruiser. I did this several times, my jeans soaked, me shivering with cold and fear. It was about the 4th time or so that I did this that I noticed the car was driving much slower than the 65 miles per hour speed limit. Was this Mike coming to kill the suspected narc? I stayed low and prepared to run. As it got closer, I recognized my friend's minivan. I stood up, waved, and hoped for the best. My friends told me that the scene inside the house had turned to absolute chaos after I kicked the door open. Mike had gone ballistic, screaming that I was a narc and that he was going to kill me. He had picked up a gun and pointed it at my friends, telling them he was going to kill them for bringing a narc to his house. They insisted that I was not and that he had just scared me. He then stomped down the hallway and fired the gun several times out of the door I had kicked open. My friends took advantage of this moment to pull the couch out of the way and run out the front door, jumping in the minivan and tearing off down the lane. After turning onto the road, they saw headlights behind them, intentionally killed their lights, and turned down someone else's lane. They waited a while and then went out looking for me, driving up and down the dirt road and highway, absolutely freaking out and not knowing what to do. They apologized profusely and insisted that nothing like that had ever happened before. We were all pretty relieved to be back together. Not long after this, Mike and several others were arrested in a drug sting. I was worried that he thought I had something to do with this and hoped he wouldn't be holding a grudge and want to come looking for me, a lingering fear that eventually subsided until one day, a couple years later. I was working at the local grocery store, and here came Mike, looking a little worse for wear. He looked right at me, and my heart almost stopped. "You're a big kid," he said. "You play football?" During my last year at girls' camp, a small group of us had a desire to reach the summit of a large hill that offered a breathtaking view above the trees and a clear sky. On that particular night, it was a new moon, and there was absolutely no light pollution. Armed with our flashlights, we embarked on the trail. As we approached about 3/4 of the way up, the 2 girls leading our expedition suddenly halted simultaneously. One of them quietly asked the other, "Do you feel that?" Being right behind them, I overheard their conversation. Scanning my surroundings, I couldn't discern anything unusual, but there was an eerie stillness in the air that sent shivers down my spine. I started to feel increasingly vulnerable and frightened. One of the girls at the front turned and advised, "We should head back, but don't run." When one of us questioned why not run, they responded that it was to avoid tripping. While a valid reason, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it than that. When I, 11, and my mom were feeding some cows we had bought with some other people, there was supposed to be 8, but when we walked into the field where they were being held, there were only 7. Suddenly, a massive black heifer emerged from some bushes about 50 meters away from us and just started bolting towards us, swinging its head wildly. I literally said to my mom, "I think we need to leave now." But the bewildered bovine would easily have sprinted us down and trampled us to death, so my mom stepped towards it, spreading her arms out wide and screaming bloody murder. It sounded like somebody had kicked a bull in the nuts, and it was luckily intimidating enough to make the cow stop and lumber away. I lived really close to my school when I was a kid, and there was this big thing for us to play in, so naturally, I always went to play there in the evening before supper or just any time I was bored. It was surrounded by a lot of houses and a busy street, so it was a safe enough place. One day, I went with a friend of mine who was about a year older than me. We had 2 schoolyards, one for the older kids and one for the younger ones. The big plastic thing was in the younger kids' yard. There was a small corridor that let us go between yards, though, and as we're playing, I see this guy wearing a hoodie with the hood up start slowly walking into the yard we were in. We stayed there for about 20 minutes with the guy, but I felt that something was very off. I was too young to really know what to do, and I imagined he would leave at some point. The problem was that he was slowly walking around a wall, blocking all the houses from seeing him, and was much closer to the exit than we were. I will always remember watching him nonchalantly kick a pizza box around as he made his way closer to us. As I turned to my friend to tell her that we had to leave because I felt like something really bad was going to happen, I heard my father below my name and saw him running the length of the schoolyard towards the door with my neighbor in tow. My father was in his 60s and took his car everywhere, and that's the first time I ever saw him really run. The guy bolted, and my father trailed after him. My neighbor brought us to my friend's house, as they all knew each other, and we stayed there until pretty late. I remember her mother trying to explain to us what a child molester was. I was 9 at most, and I just knew that I was terrified. My father, my neighbor, and my friend's father both tried to find the guy. I can imagine how scared he must have been. My father was very tall and intimidating, and so were my neighbors. The scariest part of this is that I still have no idea how my father knew, as the guy wasn't visible and I lived a few houses down from where we were. I'm sure that he saved mine and my friends' lives that day. I was waiting at the train station to pick up a friend. Since I arrived early, I decided to stand in the sun just outside the station. A man with a bicycle approached me, asking in broken English about the train's arrival time. After I answered his question, he lingered and struck up a conversation. While it's not unusual for strangers to chat, his questions and behavior gave me a creepy feeling. Eventually, he suggested I accompany him to drop off his bicycle. I hesitated because the bicycle storage area at the station was secluded, and I didn't feel comfortable being alone with him. So, I declined and walked into the station. In response, he started yelling and name-calling, but luckily, the train arrived at that moment, and the station became crowded. He left. A few months later, I came across a local newspaper article about a girl who had been assaulted at the same station. They included a sketch of the suspect, who had not yet been apprehended, and it was the same man. To this day, I'm grateful I didn't go with him. I was hiking with 2 friends through some large farms when we came across a fenced-off area with a herd of cows. Among them, there were approximately 20 calves and 150 cows. As we walked through, the cows gradually gathered behind us and literally encircled us, standing close together and facing inward. They had surrounded us from almost 300 degrees before we realized what was happening, and then we quickly ran the last 50 meters to reach the edge of the fenced area. The gap between the 2 ends of the open circle was about 20 meters, and the cows were approximately 20 meters away from us. It was quite an intense experience, and I'll never forget it. I learned to distinguish between the behavior of a single creature and that of a herd. It amazed me how they coordinated silently. I've never felt fear like that before. When we climbed over the fence, the cows followed us to the edge. There was one black bull, in particular, that seemed unhappy we had escaped. I always assumed he was the leader. When I was around 12 or 13, I participated in a school play. This was a rare opportunity to be in the school premises after it had closed for the day. I took advantage of the situation and decided to explore the empty rooms while the other students and teachers were gathered in the main hall. It was approximately 7 p.m. Towards the back of the school, there were several temporary classrooms shrouded in darkness, so I decided to venture inside. These temporary classrooms were connected by a small storeroom, which contained nothing but the usual classroom supplies. To my surprise, my English teacher emerged from this storeroom. Both the classroom and storeroom were dimly lit. I was aware that I shouldn't have been there, and I had a feeling he shouldn't have been there either. Strangely, he didn't appear surprised at all. In fact, he gestured for me to come closer and mentioned that he had something to show me in the storeroom. Something about the situation felt very unsettling to me. Without hesitation, I quickly ran away as soon as he disappeared back into the storeroom. My friend and I, both females, met up for the first time since returning home from college. It was an unexpectedly pleasant winter day, so we decided to have lunch outdoors. We discovered an empty park with a picnic table and began catching up. While we were sitting there, I noticed a scruffy-looking guy in a large windowless work van pulling into the parking lot. Initially, I didn't pay much attention to him, but I observed him moving around the van exterior and repeatedly glancing in our direction. Eventually, he walked down the sidewalk towards us, passing by our picnic table, and circled around the back of the restroom building, seemingly casing the place. Afterward, he returned to his van, and while my friend and I discussed our next steps, I observed him opening the back of the van and rummaging through it. He made a phone call, and a few minutes later, another male arrived in a different car. They conversed, with the first guy not very discreetly pointing in our direction. Immediately, they started walking towards us, prompting my friend and me to quickly gather the remaining lunch items and leave the area while keeping a watchful eye on them. It was one of those moments in my life when I could literally feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. While it might have been nothing, even now, I remain fairly certain that they had some ulterior motive, and I'm relieved we decided to leave. My friend invited me to a seminar. Everyone was dressed in white shirts, black pants, and black shoes, and I stood out as the odd one. Strangely, they were praising the founder as if he were a god. When I entered the auditorium, they were showcasing how 17-year-olds were earning 200,000 rupees a month, which is a significant amount in India, roughly equivalent to about $3,500, with their own bikes, cars, and similar things. It struck me that this was eerily similar to one of the biggest scams that used a similar business model about 7 years ago. I wanted to leave as soon as possible. My brainwashed friend was seated a few rows behind me. All those involved in this marketing were required to attend for some strange reason. It was cringeworthy at best and exploitative at worst. I never caught up with him after that. My friend wasn't a bad person, and he didn't pressure me to buy the product, possibly because I studied in a different city. While the product seemed promising on the surface, the selling method resembled that of a multi-level marketing, MLM, scheme. In the group, there was another person from my school, whom I didn't know, who compelled one of my family friends, who also attended the same school, to purchase the product. He later resorted to online swearing and abuse when she didn't buy it. I'm not entirely sure if it qualifies as a full-fledged MLM since the participants weren't coerced into buying products in bulk, probably because they were all students. I can't recall the name of the company, so I don't know if it's still in operation. A friend and I were exploring an abandoned hospital, which consisted of several interconnected buildings. All the windows and doors were boarded up, except for one spot where we could slip in through a loose board. This layout gave us access to most of the main building. It was extremely dark inside, and we had to remember which wing we had entered from. We had flashlights, so it wasn't too bad. However, when we reached a room filled with various abandoned items like beds and filing cabinets, we decided to turn off the flashlights and use the camera flash for taking pictures. We did this for about 10 minutes, relying on the camera flash to see the room. Everything seemed fine until we both began to hear strange noises. Typically, abandoned buildings are quiet except for the sound of dripping water and the occasional noise from the wind. But now, we heard floors creaking, doors squeaking, and even the occasional scraping or crashing of metal against the floor. It sounded as if someone was stumbling around in the darkness. The layout forced us to return to the source of the noise if we wanted to exit. There was only one way out, and it made us increasingly anxious. We cautiously moved back through the rooms, stopping periodically to listen. Eventually, we reached the side hall where we had entered initially and hurriedly made our way towards the door at the end. We risked turning on our flashlights to guide us. To our dismay, it turned out to be the wrong door. We stood there, listening to the approaching footsteps, feeling trapped in the darkness. If the source of the noise came down the short hall towards us, we would be in serious trouble. We held our breath, waiting and listening. The scraping and shuffling sounds drew closer, passed by us slowly, and then faded away. After a while, we cautiously left the hall and returned to the main building. Carefully, we moved one hall over, following a faint sliver of light from the loose board, and made our way toward it. Suddenly, we heard a loud scrape and bang from behind us, as if someone had knocked over one of the massive metal filing cabinets. It was deafening. I yelled, "Time to go!" And we sprinted for the door. There were clear footsteps right behind us. We threw ourselves through the loose board and ran down the overgrown path, not daring to look back. We couldn't see anything through the small gap, but we had no intention of sticking around to find out if that changed. I was in Cape Town, South Africa, with my wife for a year. We decided to go out for dinner one evening and took a taxi with the intention of getting off at Station Road. What we didn't realize is that every suburb, which is sometimes only about half a mile long, has a road named Station Road, leading to the train station. When we noticed that we had gone too far, we asked the driver to let us out. He suggested we take another taxi back to our destination, which should have raised a huge red flag. However, since it was still daylight in the afternoon, we decided to walk instead. As we walked down the one-way street, it felt like a scene from a movie, with grocery bags rolling like tumbleweeds and a kid in his underwear pretending to shoot a toy gun at us. It was relatively quiet except for these oddities. I noticed some guys behind us and saw a few more approaching from the corner. This made me uneasy, but as suburban American students, we didn't assume that a neighborhood being poor meant it was dangerous. So, I continued walking, trying not to dwell on it. At this point, the people behind us were about 20 meters away, while the others were 20 meters ahead. Suddenly, I heard an engine revving and tires screeching behind us, coming from the wrong direction. I turned around and saw a car nearly running down the guys who had to jump out of the way. The car then approached us, a newer model Corolla driven by an older Indian man in his 50s. He urgently told us to get in the car, warning us that these guys were likely going to rob and possibly even kill us. It was at that moment that everything became clear, and I understood the danger we were in. Without hesitation, my wife and I jumped into the car just as the other guys rushed toward us. The driver quickly sped away, avoiding them. As it turned out, the Indian man had observed us walking down the street and noticed the group of guys preparing to ambush us. He decided to turn around and come to our rescue. Without his intervention, there was almost no chance we would have escaped unharmed, with the possibility of my wife being assaulted and both of us potentially losing our lives in the process. When we got home, we ordered food, but my wife couldn't hold back her tears. To this day, it still feels like a miraculous escape, and I can't help but feel deeply grateful for the stranger who saved us. In early 2019, I was walking with my girlfriend through the woods near my house, a place we frequented. During a heated argument, I noticed a man wearing dark clothing and blue jeans through the trees off the trail we were on. While people often visited these woods, what struck me as odd was that this man wasn't on any established path, he was in the midst of the overgrowth. I made the not-so-wise decision to interrupt our argument, urging my girlfriend to be quiet and directing her attention in the same direction as mine. Initially, she couldn't see what I was referring to, so I suggested she look for the color blue since the man's jeans were the most noticeable feature. Eventually, she spotted him, a man walking through the overgrowth, trailing behind us. Unfamiliar with this individual and erring on the side of caution, especially with my girlfriend present, I told her, "Let's go, we need to leave." We picked up our pace, but the challenge was that we were in a remote area, far from any exits. Additionally, my girlfriend at the time wasn't particularly physically fit, making it difficult for her to walk quickly. We moved as swiftly as she could manage, and I continually glanced back to find that the old man was still following us through the overgrowth, evidently attempting to remain concealed. Eventually, we exited the woods and never returned there together. I've revisited the woods several times on my own since then and had a few eerie encounters with someone who bears a resemblance to the old man. However, I can't definitively confirm it's the same individual, as he always watches from a distance without taking any direct action. I've spotted him a total of 3 times, and it's been rather unsettling. We booked an Airbnb in Fort Worth, which initially appeared to be a spiritual retreat. Upon arrival, we encountered a padlocked gate equipped with cameras, and the lady who greeted us was barefoot. The surroundings were cluttered with furniture and overgrown shrubbery, and the main house was in a state of disrepair with rotting wood. As we entered, they asked my girlfriend and me to sign waivers, which immediately raised a red flag. We ventured outside the house to our designated sleeping area, passing by other barefoot individuals who seemed somewhat normal. Our sleeping quarters turned out to be an old RV located at the rear of the property. This RV had a collapsed front, hastily concealed with a bed sheet. Despite our efforts to rationalize the situation, my girlfriend and I became increasingly uneasy and decided to explore further to ensure our safety. During our exploration, we came across long wooden boxes with peculiar labels, intensifying our suspicions of cult-like behavior among the residents. Some individuals appeared entranced. Then, a young girl, also barefoot, approached us and engaged in a friendly conversation that took a disturbing turn. She began discussing the gruesome act of cutting and cooking people, causing us to realize the urgency of leaving the premises. I informed the lady on site that my girlfriend and I wanted to dine in town, requesting that she open the gate for our exit without arousing suspicion. Later, I recognized the main individual I had encountered at the Airbnb in a video from the Flat Earth convention on YouTube hosted by All Gas No Brakes. I was in a small room within a larger space filled with numerous servers. Server rooms always require air conditioners, so I constantly felt cold. One day, I noticed the air starting to warm up, but I didn't pay much attention and continued with my tasks. Gradually, the temperature increased, and I thought, something's wrong. It turned out the air conditioners had unexpectedly stopped working. I rushed towards the door, fearing that the servers might catch fire instantly. However, when I tried to open the door, it was scorching hot, and I struggled to turn the knob. The servers emitted a terrible noise, and the heat became unbearable. I was sweating profusely. Just before leaving the server room, I managed to restart the air conditioners and quickly informed the people at the company about the situation. Fortunately, nothing disastrous occurred because I reactivated the air conditioners. Had I not done so, I might have been in danger because if the servers had caught fire, the automatic fire suppressors, I don't know their exact name, as I'm not a native English speaker, would have depleted the oxygen supply. To this day, we're still unsure about what caused the air conditioners to malfunction. I used to enjoy driving around at night, especially because there are many country roads near where I live that were fun to zip around. One evening, after visiting a friend's house, I decided to drive to my church, which is about half an hour away from home, and back while just listening to music. I had driven this route on most Sundays for 17 years as a passenger, and I had been driving it myself for about 4 years by that point. So, even in the dark, I felt comfortable going at 60 miles per hour, which was the speed limit. After covering maybe a quarter of the distance, my stomach started twisting uncomfortably. I realized that if I continued, I would regret it. However, I brushed off the feeling, as it wasn't very late, the weather was fine, and I didn't want to miss this driving opportunity. But as I continued, the discomfort in my stomach intensified, and I eventually decided to turn around. Just before reaching the hill pass, which is about halfway to the church, I made a U-turn and returned home. The anxiety I had been feeling dissipated, and I forgot about it. The next day, I got in my car to go to church and discovered that my usual route was closed. It turned out that on the hill pass, the road had crumbled away, leaving a sheer drop. This would have been right around a blind bend for me. The road issue had been reported by a driver going in the opposite direction about 5 minutes after I had turned around and left. If I had continued, I would have likely been, at the very least, badly hurt. I catered a family reunion for approximately 200 people. From the outset, I anticipated problems because no one had a plan to pay the remaining bill. While we had received and cashed a 50% deposit to secure the date, no one had considered how to cover the rest. To address this, I informed them that I wouldn't serve the food until I received full payment. After waiting for about an hour and a half, I had collected most of the remaining amount in cash, which totaled around $3,000. Someone also wrote a check for a couple of $100 to cover the remainder, but unfortunately, it bounced and took me 4 months to recover. Once the food was served, everyone appeared satisfied, except for the event space owners. These owners had displayed shady behavior from the beginning, even switching us to a second location they owned, claiming the first one wasn't available, a classic bait and switch. Regardless, the venue owner informed me that the space had been booked for a second event starting in 30 minutes. Personally, I wasn't concerned because I had received payment and just wanted to gather my equipment and leave. However, it turned out that the second group was a college fraternity that had been expelled from campus due to violence, and they now hosted their parties elsewhere. In response, I instructed my team to leave immediately without cleaning up or assisting with packing. The fraternity members had already started causing trouble with the family reunion attendees, who were unprepared to leave. I quickly gathered all my equipment and concealed the cash in my truck before departing without saying a word. By the time I arrived home, roughly 35 minutes later, I learned from the local news that a shooting had occurred at the venue I had just left, resulting in 2 deaths and 4 individuals in critical condition. I've been part of a summer camp staff for 5 years. One long-standing tradition involves some senior staffers sneaking out during the night to hang out in town and act mischievous. On one occasion, 4 other guys and I decided to push a car discreetly from the parking lot, avoiding waking up the adults. Once we had moved the car, we got inside and headed towards town. After a few hours filled with jokes, Baja blasts from Taco Bell, and teaching one of our friends how to drive in an empty parking lot, we were driving down country roads, enjoying each other's company and listening to music. However, things took a turn when we randomly turned down a road, and something immediately felt unsettling. It was around 3:30 a.m. as we descended a hill, and suddenly, the road changed from asphalt to gravel to dirt. We noticed an old, rusted boat trailer lying on its side, along with a collection of old tools, decaying piles of wood, and a general mess. At the bottom of the hill, there was a large shed with a wide-open garage door and another makeshift plywood shed with a slightly ajar door. A faint flickering light could be seen shining through the crack of the door, and there was a fuse box right outside. The atmosphere in the car shifted instantly. For a brief moment, we all sat in silence, fixated on the flickering light. No one uttered a word, but we all sensed that something was amiss. To break the tension, we resorted to teenage boy humor, teasing one of our friends to either turn off the light or open the door. That's when the door slowly creaked open. The next few moments remain a blur, but I can assure you that it was the fastest a Toyota Camry from the early 2000s had ever sped up a dirt road. All 5 of us remained nearly silent during the 15-minute drive back to camp. There was something off about the atmosphere of that place. To this day, when I picture myself sitting in the front seat of that car, I can't help but feel an unsettling sensation in my stomach. Was there someone behind that door, and why were they there at 3:30 in the morning? A few years ago, my friend and I visited Paris when we were both in our 20s. We went to a restaurant for lunch and met someone who claimed to be the owner. During our conversation about the meal, he realized we weren't French and asked about our nationality. He then mentioned that one of his best friends was from the same nationality as us and wanted us to talk to him. He handed me his phone, and I had a brief chat with a friend. We were invited to a party with live music and drinks that evening, and since we had no plans, we exchanged numbers and agreed to meet up later. Later in the evening, we went to the address he provided, which turned out to be an abandoned place with no one around. While waiting, we started feeling uneasy. A car approached us, and it was the man we had met earlier, who was in his 50s. He was polite and apologized for the delay, assuring us that the party was nearby. We got into his car, feeling afraid but trying not to show it. We didn't know where he was taking us. During the ride, he talked about his life, mentioning how he had been in France for over 30 years and missed our country. Despite his seemingly normal demeanor, my friend and I began to realize that we had made a mistake, and it was too late to back out. We couldn't even discuss how to escape the situation. My friend was panicking, but I urged her to stay calm. Eventually, we arrived at a dark building, and there was no sign of a party. He apologized again, claiming the party was cancelled, but he suggested that we go inside to have some drinks and chat with his friends. He assured us he would drive us back to our hotel later. At this point, I told him that we'd prefer to go back to our hotel or be dropped off at the nearest bus station. He insisted on spending time with us and offering drinks as compensation for the cancelled party. I tried to be as polite as possible, not wanting to offend him, as I had no idea how he might react. He continued to insist that we come inside and even offered to cook something for us since we mentioned we were hungry. Fortunately, after some negotiation, he agreed to drive us back to the hotel. It was already 11 p.m., and we gave him a false hotel address. I felt immense relief when I saw the city lights again and realized we were safely out of his car. To this day, I can't believe how naive we were and how lucky we were that nothing bad happened.